Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'll just give it one more minute to let a few more people come along and we'll get started. Hope everyone's had a good day and enjoying lockdown 2.0. That's a bit unprecedented, isn't it? In these difficult, turbulent times. Let's see, people are coming in, that's good. It's good. So the committee is really excited to be able to present a different program for people this time. So Silver Linings 4, and we've got Silver Linings 5 in the pipeworks. This one's Inventing a New Future. And so we're hoping that there will be some things in here that will inspire you in your practice working with schools and your communities. So thank you for joining us today. Silver Linings 4, Inventing a New Normal. So this forum allows us to connect with our fellow museum educators and public programmers to discuss the impact of COVID-19, and the ENVI committee hope to discover and suggest some positive ways for us to move forward. We might go to the next slide, please. We're recording the session today, so we'll just ask everyone to mute their microphones. If you've got any questions and you want to talk, you're welcome to put your hand up or to ask a question in the chat room. And we're hoping that, you know, this will provoke some conversation that happens in our website, where you can fill it, you know, right on our website, or on Facebook as well, or even Twitter, which isn't up here, but it does exist. So we encourage you to connect with us through those different mediums. I'm Christine Healy. I'm the president of ENVI. And we might go to the next slide. Thanks, Andrew. And I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. And for me, this is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their spirits, ancestors, elders, and community members past and present. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. And I invite you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're on by posting their name in the shared chat window. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Andrew or the committee for helping with this presentation. So it's really been a group effort. And I really appreciate the support that that they've given in being able to offer this program as well, and as well as their time and their contributions. And in particular, I'll hand it over to Pete at this point, who will do a brief sub-introduction, I guess.
Excellent. Look, thanks very much, Christine.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Just muted. I'm worried about the technology. Today we're going to hear from two fantastic speakers. We're going to hear from Andrew Hiskins, who's going to give us a bit of a theoretical framework this afternoon about looking at the future. And then we're going to look at a practical example of dealing with the future as it's happened. And that's Ben Liu from the Royal Botanic Gardens. It's my great honour to be able to introduce Andrew Hiskins. Many of you will know him. He's been president of ENVI for what, 8 to 10 years or something, and he was president of MA Education, which is the national body, for probably 8 to 10 years as well. He's been nominated to be president of Amaga Vic, and I think that's going to happen. That happened pretty soon.
It has happened Tuesday.
It has happened. So are you president?
I am. I'm a serial president.
Andrew's career has involved working both at the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK, but for many, many years he was in a senior position in the State Library of Victoria, and they did some fantastic things there. He's now running his own consultancy and based pretty much on strategic planning, I think. Is that right, Andrew?
That and a bit of mentoring and other stuff, yeah. Whatever I can do, basically.
So Andrew is eminently qualified to be our presenter this afternoon, so please give him a round of applause. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. And so basically our format for today, I'll do a bit of a brief introduction and sort of thinking about how we think about the future. I've asked Ben to then give just a short case study of the stuff that they've been doing at the Royal Botanic Gardens, in particular, the way in which they've been able to, in probably an overused word, pivot, in the shift in early March or mid-March to online, and how that was really in so many ways based on some previous strategic planning work that they'd done that kind of set them up really well to know about what they wanted and what they valued in that. Then I'm going to look at a couple of tools that will really help us, to invent the future, using that phrase from the title of today's session. And Ben and I will maybe tic-tac a bit as we go through part of that, just in terms of what those ways of framing the future and how that might be construed or might play out in the work that they'd done. But equally, I want us to also be thinking about a bit more of a macro view as well. So what's important for education, what's important for young people and so on, and how do our institutions, how do our organizations contribute to that? Then we've got a bit of time for discussion and wrap up, and then Pete will come back at the end just to sort of talk about what he's planning to do with Silver Linings 5, and I think he's also will be seeing whether anyone wants to help with that as well. So I guess I'll start off by thinking I saw this photo in the window of the news agency just up the road from where I live. And, once you get halfway through the year, you think 50% off on your diaries, maybe not a bad thing. But I mean, who of us use diaries like that anyway these days? But if you take the word diaries out, really, I mean, there's this sense of what is 2020 like? I mean, we feel as though any kind of, we need a discount that's perhaps a bit bigger than our 50%. And there's a sense that, we're probably at this stage thinking, and particularly as we've gone down into a second lockdown, would it be better to just be done with 2020 at this stage, just sort of move on to 2021 or to 2022, except of course we know that we've got to go through this entire process. So it's kind of a prompt to think about that. And then I wanted to come back to the quotes that we used in the promotion for this session. But the first part of this was also we used in Silver Linings 3, the quote from Arundhati Roy, and that idea that this pandemic is a portal or a gateway between one world and the next, and that really the challenge for us is to be able to walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world. I mean, this is a unique kind of opportunity, and so that's part of what I want to talk about today. And the other quotation we used in the promotion is one that I particularly like, from Alan Kay, who is, I think he's still alive, an American computer scientist. He was certainly involved in a lot of developments along the way. And I think it's this idea of inventing the future, because we hear a lot about, and there are lots of discussions and reports and things with the notion of future proofing. And future proofing always sounds a bit anachronistic to me. It's that idea that somehow, I don't know, you can put a raincoat on. If the future is rain, you can put a raincoat on and somehow protect yourself, proof yourself against getting soaked in the future. But I think getting soaked in the future is actually what we need to do. We need to sort of think about ways of embracing it and then turn that to shaping. And if we can possibly achieve it, inventing it. So I'll start with a metaphor. And one of the metaphors of ways in which people like to think about the future is the idea of a roadmap. The idea that we can go down the street ahead of us, and then it's the first right, second on the left, third right, and then it's the fourth building down on the left. But the future never really turns out like that, does it? I mean, the future is actually something that is much more like a treasure map. It's this idea that somehow, you know, there's a question mark in the middle there. We're not quite sure. It wasn't that thing that we've crossed out there. And treasure maps, of course, often had sea monsters and there were pirates and so on. So when you're trying to navigate that kind of level of uncertainty, what you really need is tools for navigation. And that's partly what we want to talk about today. So this is a matrix that was developed as part of, and I'm peering onto a screen here, a paper on a technique called the 3 horizons, which is what I'm principally going to talk about later on. But if you think about different ways of thinking about the future, in this matrix on the x-axis, you've got uncertainty from low to high and agency from low to high on the y-axis. And so in the bottom left corner where you've got forecasts and plans, this is the kind of stuff that actually has, you know, low level of agency. You don't need much agency to be able to operate in this space because the level of uncertainty is low. So if you think about it, if I'm thinking that I want to go into the city on the assumption that I might even want to do that during a lockdown, but if I were, and I was going to catch a train in, then I would know that I could look at a timetable, I could work out what time the train is, I could work out how long it takes me to walk to the station. To walk up to the station, I could hop on the train with maybe a few minutes to spare, and that would take me to the city. It's all very easy to do, very, very predictable. On the right-hand side, if you go up in the uncertainty side, you've got scenarios. And scenarios is where you've got a higher level of uncertainty, but you're still not a particularly high level of agency. You're not acting on it. But you can sort of think of scenarios are where you kind of think, well, thing A might happen, and thing B might happen, and thing C might happen. And you can actually often construct hybrids of those scenarios and use those as ways of projecting into the future and thinking about what might happen. And that can be a tool. But if we move upwards in the screen to pathways, so this is an area where you've got a high level, you're moving really into an area of complexity, and you need to increase the level of agency. And that's the area that we will talk about with the 3 horizons approach. And the way in which that then helps you is that it can then give you actions that you can take. So if we move across and look at the roadmaps part there, so you've got a high degree of agency and a relatively low degree of uncertainty. This is an area where you try and engineer out your areas of uncertainty and come up with concrete things that you can actually do and execute. So that's the kind of basic map of where we're going to go. And I'm now just going to throw over to Ben to have a quick discussion about the kind of program changes that they made at the gardens across this COVID period, and how they set themselves up to do that, and the kind of values and things that they took into that planning and thinking. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. You made it sound as though we knew that COVID was coming, but I can, a bit like everyone, we certainly didn't know, but it has had, and I guess, you know, the silver linings title is perfect. Some silver linings in some ways that I hope to be able to sort of talk through a little bit just in the next few minutes. One thing Andrew did leave out is as part of his work, he has actually been working with the Botanic Gardens. I'm relatively new at the Gardens, having been there for a bit over 12 months. And in doing so, we sort of hit that refresh button, a bit like you said in the chat there, Ian. We did that a bit on learning, where we rebooted and pressed restart and all of those things at the Gardens. And in a number of workshops, we worked through values within our learning team. Agreed team values, as well as a number of priorities for us over the next 3 years. And I was only looking back at them a couple of days ago, and some of the priorities that we identified back then were refreshed program opportunities. The Gardens has a really strong following of schools that do the same program every year, and it's a very static sort of offer, I suppose, We only engage with schools in one particular way. And the programs have stood the test of time, but they often haven't really been refreshed over that time either. So we wanted to refresh some of our programs. We wanted to offer programs that, increase our program diversity and appeal to different audiences. We generally attracted a primary school audience within the local area. We wanted to work with more external partners. We wanted to reduce the barriers to participation in our gardens programs. And we also wanted to collaborate more internally with different departments within the organisation as well. And so they were our sort of 5 areas. And I went away from that meeting thinking, great, we've got these priorities areas. Now all I need, I suppose, is a roadmap essentially to get there, like you were talking about before, Andrew. And thinking, that's going to be my work for the next year, is to build this roadmap. And I know, the budgets and the staffing and everything that I have. And then, of course, that all got turned upside down and, budgets disappear and roadmaps and lead to nowhere. And you're sort of thinking, where am I going? What's happening here? And the gardens, like many of your institutions, closed at the end of March, I think around the 26th of March. We're one of the last sort of organisations to close just because of our particular setting and being outdoors, I guess. And it's the first time in many years, in a long time, that I think since one of the world wars, that it had been shut down completely. And we cancelled all our bookings. And I sort of want to premise this with the fact that the learning team had never engaged in online learning with schools before. And when I say that, I really mean it. The team had not used, hadn't heard of WebEx, Zoom. We all had this strange program icon at the bottom of our computers called Teams that we'd never heard of or never pressed the button on before. And so 1 week after the gardens closed, we were all forced to work at home. And someone said, try clicking that Teams button and see what it does. And eventually, through just working at home, everybody figured out how to join in a web conference or a web meeting. And from there, I guess we started to think, I think we could do something here with students. And so 1 month after we closed and cancelled all of our Term 2 programs, we actually started delivering online programs, and they started to include a digital session with an educator. We booked in schools individually. So we have about 15 educators. So we're able to take a number of bookings each day, depending on who was there. And as part of that booking, they would have a webinar with a learning facilitator. They'd have access to a resource pack that we'd developed using a pretty simple program called Padlet that was relatively accessible to every school out there. And then also a student challenge. At that point, students were learning at home, so we designed these challenges based around things that students would be able to do in their own backyards, with the idea of getting students outside for part of the day as well. And I guess in designing them, we thought, well, if we don't get any bookings for this, because we've never done this before, we don't know how badly it's going to go. At least we'll be able to use those challenges when things resume to normal in 2026, and when we had to use those digital resource packs to give out to schools perhaps later on down the track as well, that we'd developed. And lo and behold, we actually booked out for the term, which was amazing, but also a lot of stress as well, in that we went from thinking we're not going to have any work to do to being really quite busy and having to train everybody up in how to use Zoom and WebEx and Google Hangouts or Google Meets and all those sorts of programs as well. Because like someone was saying before, we adapted to whatever program or whichever platform that the schools were using, which I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing in the end. And having booked out, we actually took some time in mid-May by that point to actually say, okay, how do we develop these programs really quickly in a month, I suppose, and then how do we set a better standard across all of these programs? And that the learning facilitators came together and decided upon, what aspects of each of the programs that had all been responsible for developing worked best, and they set a standard for across all of the programs that we now share, and aiming to develop all of our digital programs for the next term to that particular standard. And some of those standards are really simple things like, only so many resources within the resource pack, or that the challenge needed to be suited to or tick off on these curriculum requirements, or the web conference only went for this long because we had some learning facilitators that would talk for an hour and a half with some students. So things, just the chance to come back and negotiate on what has worked over that time and what hasn't. And then after doing a report at the end of term, and this was only a couple of weeks ago, so we had about 6,500 students engage in our digital, we call them digital garden experiences over that time, which we would usually see in term 2 roughly around 10,000 students. So it wasn't as, I was pretty impressed with the 6,000 number, considering the change that we had. But some of the even more astounding sort of things that we found when we dove a bit deeper were that we'd increased our engagement with regional schools by about 28%, and our engagement with early childhood students by over 100%. And in looking at that, it makes sense with regional students that they can actually access a gardens opportunity through the digital experiences. But in terms of early childhood, what we found is that we reached this audience that had never been able to bring 3-year-olds to the gardens simply because of their age. And so for us to actually go into their centres through these experiences was really quite unique. So that was some of the really pleasing things that we've found. I suppose we're also, like many people, thinking term 3, we might be able to get back to something normal. And that's obviously not happening, but we're going ahead with our digital experiences this term. But then upon, I suppose, a further reflection, what we looked back upon some of those priorities, and we spoke about, have we refreshed our program opportunities? I would say, yeah, we have. We've refreshed our programs, actually used this chance to look at, how do our programs better align to the current curriculum? Have we increased the program diversity, the way that we're offering our programs? Yes. Have we been able to partner with more external organisations? And this has been an interesting one, because the digital experiences has allowed us to actually work with regional botanic gardens, and particularly when we're working with regional schools, we've actually been able to have some of the regional botanic gardens who don't have education teams necessarily join in, who are right next door to the school in some cases as well, which has been really interesting. And have we decreased the barriers to participation? Absolutely. And also internal collaboration. Whilst we haven't really gone out to other divisions yet, we're set across 2 sites, like many organisations, the Cranbourne Gardens and the Melbourne Gardens. And our digital experience has actually brought both teams together. So we've had learning facilitators from Cranbourne and Melbourne delivering these programs together, which has been something that we've never had in the past. So we're getting there with that internal collaboration, even amongst our own team anyway. I think that's sort of all I had for now, Andrew, and maybe we can talk through more later, but that's a really quick snapshot. I did see there were a couple of questions that came up. Did
Can I read a couple of them for you?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Yeah, I was going to ask.
How did you promote your webinars, Ben? From Emma from Colcott.
Yeah, good question. We just through the database that we have largely, and some social media advertising, and a few networks as well. So a few environmental networks and teacher networks that we work with.
How did you get to the early childhood?
The Gardens has a relatively strong early childhood following. I think through creation many years ago of the Ian Potter Foundation's Children's Garden that we have. So it's quite a strong following. And prior to me arriving at the Gardens, the head of education at Cranbourne and Melbourne have a really strong early childhood background. So they've done that.
The second question we have from Sue at the Shriners: do you see the opportunity to keep these digital programs once we return to more normal operations?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, yeah,
that's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah, we'll actually. So we'll come to that question, I think. Yeah.
Another one, Lisa, who says, "How did you manage that not all students have access to a device?"
Yeah, that was one thing we did struggle with. And it actually got better when students returned to school towards the end of term. They would use, the one device within the classroom to all be around a smart board and things like that. So we did struggle. We often had people coming in on their parents' phones and things like that. So we'd have, Samsung 38 on the name and things like that. So yeah, we did struggle with some of those, but we did also send, for some schools asked for it to be recorded because we were doing it individually. We were able to record and send it to the school to use if they wanted it. So that was, and some of it was simply dumb luck. We toyed with the idea of doing big webinars with lots of schools at once or individual bookings. And it wasn't necessarily a strategic decision to go with individual bookings. It was more, we didn't want to overwhelm ourselves, seeing we were pretty unfamiliar with what we were doing.
A question from Christine. Are the programs free or did you charge for them?
Yeah, they are free. So I think that also, well, obviously that would help. But we couldn't really figure out at that point in such a quick turnaround how to charge for them. And the other bigger reason was because we'd never delivered them before. We thought we can't be charging for something that we feel will go horribly wrong at some point. So that was one of the other reasons.
Yep. One from May. How did you manage your staff while everyone was off-site?
That was by far the biggest challenge. We have fantastic staff who are brilliant at what they do and have done for many years on site. To suddenly switch to off-site was, if someone had said to me 4 months ago, then you have to get the learning team to deliver only digital programs and you're not allowed to see each other face-to-face to plan them, and you have to have them all up and running within a month, I would have just laughed at them and probably quit the job. But the opportunity and that old saying that necessity and all that is mother invention, meant that we did a lot of long training sessions with people. We had educators that were sharing their screen and couldn't get out of it and sharing all sorts of things that they shouldn't have been with each other. Lots of training sessions doing that. Lots of things where I thought, and some of this was 2 minutes before the school was about to join us, and just thinking, oh my God, what is going to happen here? This is going to be terrible. For some reason, and I'm not sure why, well, there's one big reason, but they all seem to work out. We did employ about a month before the lockdown a fabulous new booking officer at that point who had experience in this space, and she was, we couldn't have done it without her, and we didn't strategically employ her because we knew COVID was coming or anything like that. But yeah, that was having that one person on site who had the patience and time and experience to actually train everybody in the platforms was amazing.
One last one before we throw back to Andrew. Yeah. A good one from Kate Morris in Tasmania. How long were the sessions?
Yeah, so the early childhood sessions largely went for about 20 to 30 minutes, and primary and secondary anywhere from sort of 30 to 45 minutes. 45 minutes was generally the most. We did have some senior sort of secondary ones that went for a lot longer, with a break in between and out and about and things like that. So, yeah.
Hand over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for that, Ben, because I think that lays a kind of groundwork of understanding of that particular program that we can actually use, as I said earlier, to kind of tic-tac as we go through the ways of framing the future through 3 horizons. So we start with a matrix, obviously. On the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have scope and scale. So what we mean by scope and scale is that sense of, like, how much effort is it? How big is it? How much of our time does it take up? How expensive is it? It's a kind of mix of all of those kinds of things. And I should say too that these slides and this thinking, the slides are adapted from a presentation which you can watch on YouTube. It's in the sources thing in the back at the end of this slide deck, which was developed by Kate Rayworth, who's an economist who is mostly famous for writing a book called Donut Economics. But it's also, as you can see here, based on the work of Bill Sharp. And there are multiple versions of Three Horizons. There's one that's a bit more corporate that comes from McKinsey, but I think this one is more about creating social good. It's that kind of, you know, how do we make big changes in the world? And so that's why I wanted to frame it this way. So let's think of these overlapping curves. So Horizon 1 is your business as usual. It emphasizes what's known, what's taken for granted, and what we assume will always be with us. And it focuses on maintaining stability. It's really a managerial way of going about things, and it's linear, it's predictable, it's got plans, it's got KPIs. It's the kind of stuff that really in our day-to-day work we spend most of our time doing, probably at a cost to our thinking about the future and how we might want to change what it is that we do. The third horizon in green, H3, is our emerging future. And so this kind of emphasizes the new, the transformative, the visionary, and it's a break with past traditions and current assumptions. So this is the thing that kind of liberates you to do new things. And you know, whereas H1 is managerial, H3 is a visionary mode of thinking. And this second horizon, the one that sits in the middle, H2, our dotted line there, is it emphasizes incremental adaptations and actions around resisting change and practical new innovations that create opportunities for change. So the predominant way of going about that is entrepreneurial. But it's a way of spanning and bridging between H1, your business as usual, and H3, your emerging future. And the other thing also to think about is that all of these things represent, you know, there's a level of opportunity costs because we devote our time and effort to these things. So this is a quote from Bill Sharp, but I think the key thing is to think of each of these horizons as a different quality of the future in the present. That's the key part of this quote. Different qualities of the future. And if you think about those different ways of thinking about it, you know, if from a Horizon 1 point of view, if you think of the mindsets, you know, they look at Horizon 2 and think that's too risky. They look at Horizon 3 and they think that's irrelevant. You know, Horizon 2, think of Horizon 1 in a negative way as being obstructive. They think of Horizon 3 as being impractical. And Horizon 3, if they look at Horizon 1, think they're just dinosaurs. And if I go down the Horizon 2 path, that's a compromise on my pure objectives. But if you shift and think about positive perspectives, you can see that Horizon 1 might look to Horizon 2 and think there are some ideas here. And there is hope in Horizon 3. They might look, Horizon 2 might look to Horizon 1 and think, well, Horizon 1, I can get support there because they value those ideas. And I can look to Horizon 3 for inspiration. And Horizon 3 can look at Horizon 2 and think, well, I've got an ally there. These entrepreneurs are at least moving down the path that I want to go to. And they can look at Horizon 1 and think, and here is a pathway to scale. This is a way in which we can make these kinds of changes and perhaps make them happen. And so the important thing to remember too is that once you know, if you find yourself in, you know, a managerial mode or an entrepreneurial mode, or if you are lucky enough to have the opportunity to dream about ways in which you might change what it is that you do and how that might, you know, have a broader impact in education and the lives of young people, then the important thing to think, you don't have to be locked into each of these positions. They are in fact mindsets. And if you think about a mindset as a way of, as a perspective, then you can actually use that to understand what those other perspectives are and how you might negotiate and have those discussions with gatekeepers or others who are responsible there. So there are a number of ways in which the H2 can go wrong. And when it goes wrong, what happens is that disruptive innovation is captured by the first horizon. And what it means is that it typically extends the life of the thing that was that was your business as usual. So if you think about what happened recently with schools and doing online learning and so on, some schools actually just put the whole of their unaltered timetable online via video calls. And that is a pretty good example of disruptive innovation captured by Horizon 1. The other thing that can happen is that you can have disruptive innovation that's harnessed for Horizon 3. So, you know, while other schools maybe took a different path and they allowed for a fair bit of self-directed learning with little access to teachers, both of those extremes obviously have limits. So the most effective models often combined, you know, both a blended experience with intensive synchronous and asynchronous, you know, student focused learning. And so there are ways in which that disruption could lead to the potential possibility, and this may happen in schools, of seeing how timetables change, of, you know, what happens in terms of the amount of project-based learning compared to what happens, and that can be done asynchronously compared to our synchronous time and so on. These things can actually change, and they can create models for change. And we were hearing that from what Ben was saying earlier. And there are a heap of different ones. I won't go through each of these where you can see that, you know, things can go wrong in different ways, but the ideal one is smooth transition, obviously, top left-hand corner, and it's probably the least likely to happen, but there are things that you need to be thinking about. So Horizon 3 is about really sort of what is being born and how can we help it to arrive well. And it's often unwise to rule anything out just because we don't understand it, because it's about possibilities, and possibilities are about things that are still kind of seeds in some way. We don't know what the plant is going to grow into, which is an appropriate metaphor given we're talking about the gardens. Horizon 1, I mean, if we think of that as business as usual, but often these, you know, your Horizon 1 stuff has the seeds of its own failure in it. So what's dying and how can we help it to leave well? And, you know, and then Horizon 2, just to reiterate what's being disruptive. And we know that in our current circumstances that a lot of disruption was because of COVID. How can it be harnessed, which is your H2 plus, and not captured, H2 minus. So just going back to this, that's the framework in summary. It can be also used as a tool to map in a kind of group strategy workshop. So I'd like to just talk you through that bit now, because these are ways that you can actually use it. So if you draw it up large scale on a wall, this is on the assumption that you can actually, you know, get close to your team at some point in the future, but there are, you know, there are tools available online which enable you to do post-it note, butcher's paper type of stuff. Things like Mural or Miro allow you to do these things in an online environment. And then you have discussion in groups, and you can populate your 3 horizons. So if we think about this point A, you know, what's business as usual? What are the key characteristics of the prevailing system? And I think, Ben, what you were talking about earlier, you know, it was predominantly face-to-face. You knew that the audience was limited in certain ways. Jump in if you want to. You know, there are a range of things that were characteristics of that business as usual.
Yep.
It's also useful sometimes to understand how we got to that business as usual, because often those values, the cultures, the rules and things are endemic constraints. And in thinking about how change happens, you need to understand what those constraints are and how they can be fixed or changed or challenged. Why do we believe, this is point C, why do we believe it's not fit for purpose and is failing? And what kind of examples can we think of that? So, you know, how fast do we want to see the decline as well? Because if we look at that slope coming down there, you know, down here, like a rapid decline is rarely beneficial. You don't want to collapse, right? And the other thing too is to sort of think here, D, what is valuable in the old system that you'd want to retain rather than lose? Can be things like infrastructure, or again, if we're thinking about the specific example, Ben's specific example, but the same will be true for many of you, you know, face-to-face is still a thing that's valued. So how can you have a hybrid that allows for some engagement which might utilize newfound capacity and thirst and hunger for online learning and online programs, but also what are the things that you really want to continue and value, and how can you hybridize those things? And what is the future that we want to bring about? And I think Ben, in talking about the strategic planning, you again you recapped it at the end of your part of the presentation, just sort of thinking about those key touch points that you actually had advanced on because of this kind of disruptive period in the middle. But it's also clearly a time for reflection. You know, what are the things that will be retained in a post-COVID world? This is interesting. So this is the idea of what are the seeds of the future that are visible in the present, you know, pockets of the future in the present. And there's a great quote that I love about this kind of thing, which is from William Gibson, the author. The future is already here, it just isn't evenly distributed. So if you know where to find these things, often they're there. And this is what, you know, good research and good benchmarking and things can help you with. And looking back, you know, whose work are the things that have created those possibilities? Again, it's good to understand the history and how it's got there. And also, how might those things be scaled and spread? And so, you know, who are the people who have actually taken it even a bit further and seem to be having success? So again, this is that thing of kind of benchmarking, being aware of what other people are doing. You know, what are the competing visions of the future that are being pursued by others? And are there opportunities there to collaborate on some of these things? Or are there some things that are just competing and you just want to avoid them derailing your own vision? And J, you know, is about, you know, what is the force of disruption? We know that in the present moment, that key force is around COVID and the flip-flopping between lockdown and not lockdown, and we don't quite know what's happening, and that difficulty, obviously, in even planning for or thinking about the future. But there are other things as well, you know. I mean, technology classically was seen as a major disruptive innovation, and there are heaps of things that can cause disruption at different times. We just are in one that is major. So, and then, and Ben, actually, I think what we might do is we might hold off talking about some of your examples with these pivot points when we go to the discussion more broadly, because that way we can have a broader discussion with the group. And Kay, if you are a disruptive actor, what kind of guidance can you set for yourself? So that's that sense of where did we want to take it that Ben was talking about. And it wasn't really seeing themselves as being disruptive at that point. It was seeing themselves as sort of thinking about what a future might be. So these are some of the questions that you can utilize in a workshop type scenario. And ta-da, you don't have to do it alone, because there's a fantastic booklet, and this again is going to be on the slides, the link to get this. Kind of gives you a playbook, a how-to for workshops, or if you prefer to call it a lesson plan for how to do this kind of thinking. And you just blow up your big 3 horizons like this, and you play with post-it notes, or you do it visually, or use online tools. But it's interesting because there are some, in some of one of the papers that I came across, it's a piece of work that was done in Scotland that looked at, specifically looked at education at a kind of macro level and thinking about things that constraints and things that weren't working. So you sort of see, you know, over here you have this idea that assessment, written exams of individuals' performance as a sort of a poor way of necessarily, you know, judging everything about learners, and you know what other options are there in terms of how these kinds of things might be done. And indeed, you know, there's a lot of work being done at the moment around how to measure how people work against the capabilities, and how to have a broader range, you know, the idea of a kind of a learner portfolio and all of that kind of stuff. So there are things that we can consider that kind of sit within a broader macro, how does this look like for all of learning, for all of education as well. So that is in, it's in this paper that's referenced here. There was some other work that was done by a guy called Graham Lester, again in Scotland, that particularly looked at a map against the impact of COVID-19. This isn't specifically about education, but it takes education into account in that. So they're, you know, really interesting ways of using these things as prompts that kind of work against our unconscious biases as well in terms of how we think about things. And the other thing, I guess, is what are the constraints and how do we think about how change might happen? And so I've got just one other concept to add before we kind of move towards a more general discussion. And that's a thing called the Overton window. And particularly this applies in politics and kind of broader kind of social policy issues more broadly. But if you think about this idea that things often come about because they start to become seen as being acceptable and then sensible and then popular even, and then they become policy, they become something that's accepted by government and society more broadly, but they've moved from that unthinkable and radical thing. And it's kind of like it's a very special window of opportunity that exists. And so thinking about like changes in education more broadly, I mean, I think this is one of the things that will have an impact. And I mean, a classic example, you can imagine how say marriage equality fits within this. And, you know, the 50s, unthinkable. At a certain point in the 60s, it starts to become radical and probably remains radical for a very, very long time. It starts to become more acceptable at a certain point in the middle, and you get other, you know, you get some changes in laws that make, say, homosexuality legal. And then you get this sort of move, and ultimately you end up with marriage equality and so on. So you can kind of see how in broader social movements, this thing is a way in which the world works. So we'll just sort of wrap up this part with a quote from a teacher, and this is in a paper that was put out by Melbourne Graduate School of Education recently. And the quote finishes, you know, by saying that COVID is, you know, really providing that opportunity to think about what do we truly value in education, what are we doing well, and what can we do to better and grow. We go back to that quote from the beginning from Arundhati Roy. What are the ways in which we can walk through lightly with as little luggage as we can manage, and ready to imagine another world, and ready to really fight for it and make things happen. So, open for discussion. What I would say is that I think one of the important things is to recognise that all cultural organisations are built around a set of values that, of necessity, have a bit of a future focus. And I think that's one of the things that I think that we're perhaps not very good at selling in our education programs. But if I take the gardens as an example, when that planning happened, the first planning workshop, which I did go to with Ben and his team, I mean, key things come out as shared values within the team. And we're just talking about the team dynamics at this point, but they're like a real commitment to the environment, to sustainability, concern about climate, a real commitment and interest in Indigenous understandings of nature and the world. These are things that are important ways of framing our thinking about the future. And for the Royal Botanic Gardens, obviously, they make a lot of sense to have those things aligned. And if you think about a key issue in terms of education, whether people come to our programs or not, is about relevance. And being relevant, you know, one measure of relevance is how does it match against the curriculum? But probably in some way a more philosophically important measure of relevance is how important is it to the future, and how important is it to help us, to help teachers and schools and young people, to equip those young people to better manage the future and to be better equipped to thrive and invent it themselves. Anyway, that's me done. And over to discussion, questions, so on.
Ben, can you see Christine's question there, or would you like me to read it?
I should be able to find it.
I'd be interested to know Ben's response to having a theoretical lens placed over what happened kind of organically at your place.
Yeah, Christine, as Andrew has explained that model to me just in our preparations a couple of times. I think I now understand about 10% of it, but what I can pick up, I suppose, from different parts of that diagram, some of those different points that you outlined there, Andrew, were things such as, you know, what do we want to keep from the business as usual going forward, or what would be valuable in the new and emerging future, I suppose. And you spoke about face-to-face experiences. We booked out of all of our programs really early in term 2, and we had, you know, a waiting list of schools who we could say to those schools, listen, you can't do a webinar with us because we're booked out, but we can still give you the learning resources, and we'll actually do we recorded some webinars that we can give you instead, so you can watch one of the presentations, and we'll give you the student challenge as well. And what really we found out really quickly is we'd pass all that on to the teacher, and none of them would look at it, none of them would use it. What was of most value was that face-to-face. And even though it was digital, that was the real hook, I think, to getting people to then use the resources and use undertake the student challenges and things like that. So that is, I suppose, a learning that we've had in that the value and of the experience of our educators and our staff is still what was of highest importance to the people coming to our experiences. Does that answers one of those points? I have to think back through some of the others, I suppose. But I'm sure there'd be plenty of other people that would be able to pick up on different areas that they've found.
Yeah, well, picking a time and a place means that you're both committed to being in that time and place in that moment, and so you kind of have to be there. But Sue asked earlier about, you know, the sorts of things that you're going to take into the future, I think.
Yeah, Sue did do that. We, as part of a review that we did at the end of term, you know, we asked that question around what would the future, if we went back to face-to-face teaching next term, we were very ambitious at the time, you know, what would we keep from the digital experiences? And because I guess I thought people would just say, let's just get rid of them and just go back to what we were doing. But I was actually really buoyed by the fact that everybody said, I actually think we should keep doing the whole experiences in some form, or at least dividing up some of the elements that we've created to enhance our regular programs. And where we sort of settled as a team is that we've really loved the fact that we've been able to reach out to regional schools. We're not previously, I was working at the zoo, and the zoo attracts schools from all over the state because you don't get to see elephants everywhere. You don't get to see gorillas, everywhere. But lots of regional towns have botanic gardens. And so you're not necessarily, when you're going to come to the city, going to come to botanic gardens. But what we've been able to do, as I was saying before, is actually work with those regional botanic gardens and the schools in those areas through these digital experiences. And that has just been a really unique and amazing experience. And something that, as the state botanic garden, we should have been doing in the first place, is supporting those regional gardens as well. So that is something that the team has sort of really clung to and saying that is what we want to take forward, is that reach into those regional areas and supporting our regional botanic gardens through these experiences. So that's probably been one of the main things, but lots of other smaller things as well, and smaller elements that we want to keep.
It also probably creates an opportunity for you, Ben, and for anyone having those hybrid programs, to have, you might have that face-to-face experience that is somewhere on site. That might be a core part of an experience. But in some cases it's not possible, so it won't happen. But in other cases it can be supplemented, and it can mean that your relationship with the school can be a bit more longitudinal. You can have an intro and things, and it means also that you can, if that's done in an online environment, then that saves you time and you get better value out of your face-to-face, physically being together, on the assumption that will ever be possible again. I'm sure it will be. And so, there are all of these different ways in which you can mix and match and try things out and see what works. I think, that's one of the really significant shifts.
We've got a couple of other questions here, but Ben, can I throw in one? The work that you did initially around values and your priorities, do you think having done that work made you more able to cope with the disruption of COVID?
Yeah, it did. Well, looking back on it, it did. I probably hadn't realised how much. And the reason why I think it did is because within we spent a few days as a team workshopping through a plan that Andrew and I had put together. And I guess that actually marked a start of change anyway. So what that did is it put in the minds of everybody that change was going to be happening, and that they had a role to play within that. And it obviously came a lot quicker than what we had thought, but I guess that had opened the idea to change and to innovation. And whilst this was forced upon us in a different way, I think that we had far more of a positive mindset towards that change than what we would have had if we hadn't done that planning before. And even that idea of identifying different priorities and things like that has helped set that positive mindset towards change. So, yeah. Does that answer it, Peter?
Yeah, it does. We've only got about a minute or so to go.
Yeah, and Pete, you're going to have to introduce the next one too.
Yeah. So,
oh no, we're going over.
Are we going over?
We're going over. Yeah. If people need to drop out, we understand, and we thank everyone for coming along. This is going to be available as a recording for people to watch later. But if you can hang around a little bit longer for the tail end of this, that would be great. Thank you.
Right. Ben, May asks, did you convert existing stuff to digital, or did you make completely new digital programs?
Yeah, good question, mate. And so I don't want to, I feel like what I'm saying is, speaking as the oracle here, but we have fumbled and bumbled our way through this whole experience. And it is more about learning from our mistakes than what we've done. But what we did start with the idea of saying, okay, what are our most popular programs? How do we take what we did on site and into digital? And very quickly realize that it's actually just a poor version of what we used to do, of what we're used to doing. And actually the learning facilitators themselves, you noticed them when I was watching the first few sessions thinking this is all going to come horribly crashing down on us. I'd watch the sessions and you'd see them naturally adapt the program to be better suited to the context of a digital session and the students, and leaving certain things out but bringing in other things as well, to the point where we had some of our learning facilitators who at their home set up rooms and offices with their own sort of backdrops and props and things and puppets and a whole range of things that they'd brought in from their kids' old toys and things like that, which when we stopped and said, okay, what's the standards that we want across all of our programs, we realized that we had to actually drop a lot of the on-site things that we tried to bring on-site and actually embrace some of the newer aspects that people had sort of just invented on the spot in some cases.
There was a great quote, Ben, in the report that you sent to me from one of the teachers who had a class who did it, who said, "The experience far surpassed our expectations. Learning facilitators number 2 and 3, presumably named, were knowledgeable hosts and very responsive to the students. The students were thoroughly engaged and invited by the hosts to take part by sharing their knowledge, understandings and questions. Our teachers, Justin and Craig, were very appreciative that the experience was modified to hone in on our unit of inquiry focus around interdependence between living things." Just fantastic. So I think, yeah, that capacity to, and that's one of the reasons why co-presence, by being present even virtually together at the same time, is so important, because you adapt it to, it's much more tailored, it's much more personalised.
And with the success of these programs, Kate's asking, Alex is asking, are you facing organisational pressure now to charge for it?
Yeah, it's interesting. No is the biggest answer, which I'm really lucky and fortunate to not have to do. The Gardens doesn't bring a lot of income in, being a free venue. We do charge for our learning programs, but it's not a huge income. So the whole organisation has changed to adjust for that loss at this point. But I know of many other organisations, and perhaps yourself as well, Alex, where there is pressure. And if there was, I'm not sure how I would deal with that. But so I've been really fortunate in that, no, there hasn't been at this point. But who knows how long this would or that will last for.
You were talking about your being able to be involved with regional gardens, and Kate asks, did the regional gardens join in the online sessions with schools?
In a couple of the cases, yes, they were able to. A lot of the regional gardens don't have dedicated learning or education teams. They might have a visitor officer, or in some cases they've just got a horticulture team, essentially. And so where a couple of them have, and it's usually been their horticulture staff that have a passion for education as well, or sometimes in one of the cases, a student at the school is one of their kids as well. But yeah, I guess that was we've only had that a few times that it's happened, but it's a model that we're really looking forward to exploring more in the future, and through our own Botanic Garden network. I think we'd like to do that.
And a comment from Christine: "You are the oracle."
Well, then we're all in trouble, is what I say to that. Yeah, all in trouble. Yeah, you can make things sound good when you don't go too deeply into the detail, I think sometimes.
Also, when you tell the story, the narrative, you reframe what happened, to your point,
yeah.
That you just make it up as you go along, but it sounds as though there's an incredible logic. And that's why sometimes having tools to help you navigate and think about the future is really helpful, because it just gives you that extra degree of insight into what you're doing and why you're making certain decisions.
And one thing, Andrew, just really quickly, you talked about the seeds are already there often. And, you know, we have one member of staff who had a background in as a videographer, and we knew that, but it just didn't fit in with what we did as our usual business as usual model to ever include videos. And so we never really capitalized on it, never really thought that it would suit what we did. And she has spent this whole time essentially creating, you know, about half a dozen different videos for each, videos for the different programs that we're offering alongside our resource packs. And that has probably been something that I've realized, you know, she had spoken to me about, you know, I'd love to be able to do something to create some videos for our programs a year ago, but we just didn't have that opportunity. The seeds were there. They just sort of needed this chance to come to to germinate in our language.
Yeah, and there's a point about having some of those things captured, you know, some kind of learning tools that are captured and you just parcel them out and use them like a pre-recorded video, because sometimes, you know, you can use those things to do some of the heavy lifting in terms of to do some of the just, you know, the regular stuff like the intro to something. Do you really want to repeat the intro all the time? Whereas, you know, you might get better value from your educators being able to do the engagement stuff and adapting, and use the pre-packaged videos for things where that's a perfect tool. So thinking about what's the right tool as well means that you can get more value from your humans.
Ben, could teachers keep up with the technology that you were offering them as well? Were they able to facilitate their students being present easily enough?
It helped when schools returned to school, because obviously they then were in charge of the technology themselves. But it really varied, I guess, a bit like our own learning facilitators. Some picked up on it quicker than others. But I'm not sure if it's a reflection on our skills or that of the teachers, or a bit of both. But towards the end of term, we'd ironed out a lot of the bumps, both at their end and our end. And so we're hoping, fingers crossed, for a much smoother term 3 as we deliver these, because it felt towards the end of term like it had sort of worked its way, or we'd worked through a lot of the issues and the common issues and things like that. So we're
Ben, in your report, in your written report, there was another quote from a teacher who said, "I think today's presentation really engaged our students. At times they would make some pretty quirky comments. Then you would see that something shared by Learning Facilitator 4 had really touched them. It would have been so easy to throw up our hands and give up on the technology half an hour beforehand. So glad we didn't."
Yeah, I do. I vividly remember that one. I was ready to give up on the technology as well.
Yeah, but sometimes just muddling through. And also it's an interesting share in terms of shared psychology, that thing of muddling through and actually getting something to work actually binds you. You know, there's an element of social contract there that means that you're much more human, even though you're separated by screens and cameras and microphones and things like that. You've had a shared experience, and that just makes everything, it lifts everything else.
Oh, absolutely. There are some teachers who, they'd book in multiple classes over different days, and by the last session, when they knew the technology, we knew the technology, all of that, and we'd spoken for what seemed like hours together. We were, first name basis, as almost nicknames with each other when referring to each other and things like that. So it was that was pretty. You're right, yeah.
One last question before we throw back to Andrew is from Chloe, where she says, when you say you were booked out for term 2, how often were you running these programs?
Yeah, so we run sessions at 10, 12 and 2 o'clock, essentially. And we usually run about 2 or 3 simultaneously, depending on, and sometimes it depends on, we've got a lot of part-time staff. So essentially we're running about each week, somewhere between, each week. So I'm doing the maths really quickly. I think it's about 34 sessions a week. So yeah, it is quite a few. And the size of the sessions has been quite big. We usually have 25 students per session, but the average size last term was about 70 a session. We've actually dropped back this term on the number of sessions, just because it was I haven't told my managers this, but we have deliberately blocked some days out to give ourselves a break from teaching and to work on preparations for potentially term 4 returning to teaching as well and things like that. So yeah.
And thank you, because that's actually, you're doing a bit of H3 work there. That's your third horizon. You're actually thinking about that and planning that part.
And in terms of the number of staff that were involved, we have 12, 13, 14, 15 staff delivering. So they each do, 2 sessions a week, which isn't, it's far less than their normal capacity of what they'd be doing. But for some reason, I'm sure most people would find this, even though we're closed down and, all that, we're busy, we seem to be busier than ever. So, yeah.
The other thing, probably, Ben, to add too, is that the other major constraint to you when you were doing your physical programs is, of course, when it rains, or when you
Yes.
storms. Because I remember, us talking about that, and just sort of what do you do, because it means that you end up with a bit of downtime for your staff.
Yeah.
And so actually having some other options, or being able to say, well, we won't do this, but we'll do that. Again, this gives you some other options, and that's a constraint that you have in this role, but also presumably had at the zoo when you were there. That only not so many of our organisations have. Some have, but not all by any means.
We're getting a lot of people saying thank you, Ben. Your practical insights have been really well appreciated, and look, congratulations. I think you've done a fantastic job of really.
No, I have to admit, I gave you the highlights. There are just there, and I'm truly mean this. There were a lot of things. It is the and I can't take the credit. It is the learning facilitators who are at the coalface delivering and dealing with a lot of the issues. They have overcome barriers that I won't even be able to mention. But we'll do another session sometime that speaks to all the problems, and it'll take up 3 times the length of time. So,
So, Andrew, would you like to wrap up now?
Yeah, look, I mean, there isn't much to add to this. I mean, this slide here is some of the key sources, and so if you want to explore some of this stuff a bit more, that's me. But now, Pete, I think I'll just put that quote that we had before from the teacher from that COVID-19 report from Melbourne Graduate School of Education up, and perhaps if you want to talk about, introduce the next silver linings.
Fantastic. Look, can I just say thank you both to Ben and to Andrew, because a really, really interesting session and really thought-provoking. Wonderful to have both the theory and the practice brought together here. The next session that we're talking about running is to talk to teachers and to see what teachers have learned from remote teaching and learning. And the concept for this really came about when we thought probably remote learning had finished, and yet it may be going on, And what we're after is to get some information from the horse's mouth, What is it that they found good? What is it that they found difficult? And what is it that they found interesting? And how is it going to change the way that they teach? Now, not all teachers see this as an opportunity. Some of them see it as a problem. There is a great report out that Andrew has referred to, which is the Australian Education Survey, and that was done by the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. We're trying to get one of those authors of that report to speak at our next session as well. But we also want to get about 3 or maybe 2 or 3 teachers. So I'm keen, if you know of any teachers who might want to present, who are going to be good, who've got something to say, and might help us in our institutions to understand what the practical sort of what the practicalities were and what they have learnt about student learning, really. So that's where we're headed. And we're looking at running this program on the 20th of August, and it'll be a slightly later time so that we can involve the teachers, and it will be between 4 and 5 p.m. So did I just put up my details there? Did that come up?
No.
But if you know a teacher who would be happy to be involved in the next Silver Linings session, please email me, and it's at hoban@encable.net.au. So that's actually in the chat line there as well.
Yeah.
Otherwise, are we done?
I was just going to add. Melbourne Graduate School have also got a couple of seminars coming up, online seminars about the kind of changes and impacts in terms of COVID and online learning and so on, which might be which you're free to subscribe to. So they're doing a series of 4. The first one is Yong Zhao, second one is Sandra Milligan, third one is John Hattie, and then the final one is all 3 speaking. So there's that coming up as well, and we can put that up on the Envy website, just a link for that and so on, so that people can subscribe to that if they want to go to any of those sessions. And they're coming up in the next month or so. I mean, weekly over the next, I think, starting in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew and Ben, and everyone else on the committee, and everyone else for coming along today. And it's been a really thought-provoking conversation, and I've downloaded my copy of the report so that I can start working through my education programs with that in mind. So thank you very much, everybody, and follow us on social media, and we'll see you at the next Silver Linings. Thank you.